Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and your bed is no longer touching the floor. Your phone drifts beside you. The walls no longer hold your house in place. Outside your window, cars rise like silent balloons. Oceans peel away from the earth. And above you, the moon begins to wander off into the black. No warning, no explanation, just one impossible fact. Gravity has vanished. And within minutes, everything humanity has ever built, every empire, every monument, every memory tied to this planet begins to drift away into space. Would you survive even a single hour? Stay with me, because once gravity disappears, the story of Earth becomes something entirely different. Before we drift into the unknown, take 1 second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now or what job you'd be doing if gravity suddenly turned off at this exact moment. Because what you're about to hear will make you look at your everyday life in a completely new way. At first, people try to treat it like a strange accident, something temporary, something explainable. Somewhere, someone must know what's happening. Scientists, governments, space agencies, someone will fix it. But the seconds keep passing, and nothing comes back. In apartments across crowded cities, people push themselves along ceilings and walls, learning in real time how to move in a world without weight. A man tries to walk down his hallway, only to drift sideways into a doorway. A woman grabs a curtain to pull herself forward, only to watch the curtain rod rip free from the wall and float beside her like a useless ribbon. The familiar rules of motion are gone. Every push sends you drifting endlessly until something stops you. Every movement becomes a careful calculation. Too much force, and you slam into something. Too little, and you float helplessly, unable to reach anything at all. And outside, the world is becoming unrecognizable. Trees begin to uproot, not by being pulled upward, but by the soil itself loosening, no longer pressed together by gravity. Whole sections of earth lift and crumble into drifting clusters of dirt, roots, and stone. Animals react instinctively. Birds, for a brief moment, are the only creatures that seem almost normal in this new world. But even they struggle. Without gravity, their wings cannot generate lift in the same way. Their flight becomes erratic, uncontrolled, until they too begin to tumble and drift. Dogs scramble in confusion, claws scratching at floors that offer no resistance. Fish in aquariums float helplessly as the water itself begins to rise and break apart into shimmering spheres that drift through living rooms and out broken windows. Somewhere a glass shatters, but instead of falling, each shard spins outward like glitter in sunlight. Time feels stretched. Each second carries more change than entire years ever did before. And then comes the sound. At first, it's subtle, a distant groaning, like a building settling. Then it grows louder. Across cities and towns, structures begin to fail in ways no one has ever seen. Nails slide out of wood, bolts loosen. Foundations, once pressed firmly into the ground by the weight of the structures above them, no longer hold anything in place. A high-rise building doesn't collapse downward, it unfolds. Floors separate one from another, drifting upward and outward like pages torn from a book and scattered into the sky. People inside those buildings scream, not because they are falling, but because they are drifting away from everything they know. And still, no explanation comes, no emergency broadcast, no sirens. Just the growing realization that this is not a local event. This is everywhere. Across continents, oceans, mountains, deserts, the same silent catastrophe unfolds. The same disbelief turns into the same fear. And in the middle of it all, something even more terrifying begins to happen. Something subtle, almost invisible at first. Your body starts to change. Without gravity, the fluids inside you begin to redistribute. Blood shifts upward toward your chest and head. Your face feels swollen. Your legs feel strangely light, almost numb. Your inner ear, which relies on gravity to help you balance, sends confused signals to your brain. Vertigo sets in. Nausea follows. You try to focus, but your mind struggles to process what your senses are telling you. Up and down no longer exist. There is no horizon, no stable reference point. The world becomes a drifting, disorienting maze. And then your breathing changes. The air, though still around you, feels different, thinner, less dense. Each breath requires more effort than the last. You take a deep inhale, and it doesn't feel like enough. All around the planet, billions of people experience the same creeping realization. The air is slipping away. High above, the outer layers of the atmosphere have already begun to expand outward into space. Without gravity holding it close, Earth's protective blanket of gases is unraveling. It doesn't disappear instantly, but it doesn't stay either. With each passing minute, the pressure drops. At first, it feels like being at a high altitude, like standing on a mountain peak. But the climb doesn't stop. The pressure keeps falling. The oxygen level keeps dropping. Breathing becomes a conscious effort, slow, deep, desperate. People who were floating moments ago now begin to panic in a different way. They clutch at their throats, gasp for air, try to find enclosed spaces, rooms, basements, anything that might hold the air in. But even those spaces are not sealed. Air leaks through every crack, every window, every door frame. And as the pressure drops further, something else begins to happen. Something almost no one on Earth has ever experienced. Sound begins to fade. Not all at once, but gradually. Voices become softer. The roar of the city dims. The wind, what little remains of it, grows quiet. Because sound needs a medium to travel, and that medium is disappearing. A mother calls out for her child, and her voice barely carries across the room. A car alarm triggers, but its wail is thin, distant, as if coming from underwater. The world is not only lifting, it is going silent. Above the drifting cities, above the rising oceans, above the thinning clouds, the sky deepens from blue to indigo to black. Stars begin to appear, faint at first, then brighter, sharper. Daytime begins to look like night. And for the first time in human history, billions of people see the universe, not through telescopes, not through filtered lenses, but with their own eyes, in the middle of what used to be a normal morning. It is beautiful. It is terrifying. Because it means there is no atmosphere left to hide behind. No shield, no protection. The sun, still shining, now pours its radiation directly onto the surface of a planet that can no longer defend itself. Temperatures begin to swing wildly, burning hot in direct sunlight, freezing cold in shadow. Your skin feels it almost immediately. And still, gravity does not return. Minutes stretch into what feel like hours. People cling to whatever they can. Families hold on to each other, tying themselves together with belts, ropes, anything they can find. In some places, people begin to understand the only possible strategy for survival: get inside something sealed. Submarines, underground bunkers, spacecraft, anywhere that can hold air and maintain pressure. But those places are few, and time is running out. Because what began as a strange morning has now become a race against the disappearance of everything that makes life possible. And somewhere, far above the drifting Earth, satellites, no longer held in orbit, begin to drift away into the darkness, carrying with them the last signals, the last broadcasts, the last attempts of humanity to understand what has happened. Their transmissions fade.
one by one, until even the machines go silent. And in the stillness that follows, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. This is not a temporary event. Gravity has not weakened. It has not shifted. It has not changed direction. It is simply gone. And with it, the very idea of down has vanished from the human experience forever. The morning is not even over yet, and already the Earth we knew is no longer there.
As the last traces of blue vanished from the sky, the planet begins to reveal a side of itself that no human civilization was ever meant to witness. From above, if anyone could still be there to see it, Earth no longer looks like a stable world. It looks like something in the process of becoming undone. The continents, once pressed tightly against the planet's surface by the relentless pull of gravity, begin to loosen their grip. The edges of coastlines crumble first, shorelines peeling away into drifting layers of sand, rock, and soil. Entire beaches rise in slow, silent sheets, like carpets being lifted by invisible hands. Cities near those coasts begin to fracture as their foundations detach from the land beneath them. Buildings tilt, not downward, but sideways and upward, before breaking apart into drifting sections. And everywhere, the water continues its ascent. At first, it forms massive, shimmering bulges above oceans and lakes. Then those bulges stretch, thin, and separate into colossal floating spheres, each one containing currents, creatures, and wreckage suspended together in a weightless prison of liquid. Inside those spheres, fish still swim for a few moments, unaware that their world has been cut loose from its home. But even that fragile ecosystem begins to break apart as oxygen levels in the water change and sunlight becomes unfiltered and harsh. From the surface, the sight is almost surreal. Globes of ocean drifting overhead, reflecting sunlight like mirrors, casting moving shadows across the broken land below. But beauty fades quickly, because water is not just rising from oceans, it is rising from everywhere. Rivers peel away from their beds, winding upward like translucent ribbons before snapping into floating fragments. Reservoirs, dams, even the water stored in pipes beneath cities, all of it begins to escape, leaking out into the open air and joining the slow exodus into space. Inside homes, droplets form in mid-air as water seeps out of sinks, tanks, and even the moisture within walls. Kitchens fill with drifting bubbles of water that collide and merge into larger spheres, floating through doorways and windows. And with every liter of water that leaves the ground, the land itself becomes more unstable. Soil, no longer compressed by weight, loosens into dust. Cliffs crumble into drifting avalanches of stone that never quite fall, just separate and disperse. Deep underground, something far more dangerous begins to change. The Earth's crust, once held together by immense pressure from the planet's own mass, starts to decompress. Magma chambers expand as the rock around them is no longer forced inward by gravity. Gases trapped for millions of years suddenly have room to escape. Volcanoes erupt, not in violent upward blasts, but in strange expanding clouds of molten rock that drift outward like glowing, deadly nebulae. Lava no longer flows downhill, it floats. Rivers of molten stone stretch into the air, forming twisting, fiery ribbons that cool into jagged, drifting structures as they move away from their source. In places like the Pacific Ring of Fire, multiple eruptions occur almost simultaneously, turning entire regions into clouds of incandescent debris suspended in the thinning atmosphere. And still, the ground continues to open. Fault lines widen as tectonic plates, no longer pressed together, begin to separate. The very seams of the planet pull apart, revealing glowing cracks that stretch for kilometers before breaking into floating fragments. Earthquakes, as humans once understood them, no longer exist. There is no shaking ground when the ground itself is dissolving. Instead, there is a slow, unstoppable disassembly. and above it all, the air continues to escape. What remains of the atmosphere forms ghostly currents, streams of gas flowing upward into the blackness of space. Winds behave unpredictably, no longer driven by pressure differences anchored to a surface, but by chaotic flows of escaping gases. Clouds distort into elongated streaks before vanishing entirely. Weather, as a system, collapses. No more rain, no more storms, no more seasons forming in the sky. Just a fading veil of air, thinning with every passing minute. The sunlight, now unfiltered by atmosphere, grows harsher. Ultraviolet radiation floods the surface, bleaching colors from the land. Shadows become stark and absolute, areas of light scorching hot, areas of darkness plunging toward freezing temperatures. The earth becomes a place of extremes. And for anything still alive on the surface, those extremes are impossible to endure. Plants, which rely on both gravity and atmospheric pressure to move water and nutrients through their structures, begin to fail almost immediately. Leaves wilt, not downward, but inward, curling as their internal systems collapse. Forests that once stretched for miles begin to fragment, trees breaking apart as their roots lose their hold and their trunks crack under stresses they were never evolved to handle. Fields of crops, wheat, rice, corn, scatter into drifting clouds of plant matter, their grains floating away like dust in a beam of sunlight. The chain of life, from the smallest microbe to the largest mammal, begins to unravel in real time. And then comes the ocean's final act. As more and more water escapes into the sky, the remaining seas begin to thin, exposing parts of the seafloor that have not seen light for millions of years. Strange, alien landscapes of ridges and trenches emerge briefly before they too begin to fracture and drift apart. Hydrothermal vents, once deep beneath crushing pressure, release their superheated fluids into an environment where pressure no longer exists to contain them. Plumes of mineral-rich water expand violently, then disperse into nothing. The delicate balance that allowed life to begin in those deep-sea environments collapses completely. The birthplace of life on Earth is erased. And still, above it all, the planet continues to lose itself. From orbit, if any camera were still functioning, Earth would now appear as a cloud of debris surrounding a dim, fractured core. Water, rock, gas, and fragments of human civilization, all suspended together, slowly drifting outward. The familiar blue marble is gone. In its place is a ghost of a planet, dissolving into the vacuum. And yet, there is still motion. Because even as Earth unravels, everything that once belonged to it still carries the same forward velocity, the speed at which our planet once orbited the sun. Without gravity to hold it together, all of that matter continues moving in the same direction, spreading out along the path Earth used to follow. A trail begins to form, a long, widening stream of planetary debris stretching through space. And within that stream, scattered among fragments of oceans and continents, are the last remnants of humanity. Tiny, fragile pockets of air and matter that were once a thriving civilization. All of it now part of a single, unstoppable migration into the unknown. The Earth is no longer a home. It is becoming a memory. And the transformation is far from over. In the final pockets of breathable air, where fragments of buildings still hold together and thin skins of atmosphere linger, the last organized movements of humanity begin, not as nations, not as cities, but as small groups of people bound by one desperate instinct: survive one more minute. Inside a drifting hospital ward, a handful of doctors and nurses cling to equipment that no longer sits still. IV bags float like transparent lanterns, monitors blink and spin.
A surgeon, still in gloves, holds onto a patient with one arm while trying to anchor a ventilator with the other. Every action requires two things now: strength and a surface to push against. Without both, nothing can be controlled. They speak, but their voices are faint, swallowed by the thinning air. Instructions are reduced to gestures. Hands become language. Eyes become the only reliable way to communicate urgency. In a floating apartment block, a family has tied themselves together with bedsheets, parents to children, sibling to sibling, forming a human chain. They move slowly, hand over hand, from one room to another, searching for anything that might help: bottled water, sealed containers, anything that might still hold pressure. A window gives way, and a sphere of water drifts in, shimmering, silent. A child reaches for it, thirsty. The parent pulls them back, unsure if it's safe, unsure of anything anymore. Across the world, in places that once relied on routine and order, the absence of gravity turns every skill into guesswork. A pilot in a grounded aircraft tries to initiate an emergency sequence, but the plane itself has begun to separate, panels floating loose, seats unbolting, the very shape of the fuselage distorting. There is no runway, no down, no sense of direction that makes sense to the body. In a laboratory, scientists try to record data. Instruments spin, fluids bead and drift out of containers, readings fluctuate wildly. They know the theory: without gravity, pressure gradients vanish, convection stops, gases expand, but knowing is different from living inside it. They type as long as they can, transmitting what little they can to networks that flicker in and out of existence. The internet becomes a patchwork of brief, fading signals. Messages appear and disappear like sparks. I can't breathe. Hold on to something. Is this everywhere? Stay with me. And then silence. The people who survive the first wave of chaos are those who happen to be inside spaces that can still trap a little air. Underground rooms, submarines that had surfaced but still hold sealed compartments, a handful of research stations designed to be airtight. In those places, a strange stillness takes hold, a temporary island of normalcy in a world that is dissolving. Inside one such sealed room, a group of strangers drifts gently from wall to wall, adjusting to the new physics. Someone finds a way to secure themselves with straps. Someone else tapes plastic over a vent to slow the loss of air. They take shallow breaths to conserve oxygen. They ration water that now floats in careful, captured globes. Time stretches. Seconds are counted not in clocks, but in breaths. Every inhale becomes a decision. Every exhale feels like letting something go that might not come back. And then comes the realization that even these small sanctuaries are temporary. The pressure inside is dropping, slowly but steadily, as air seeps through seals never meant to hold against a vacuum. There is no external. There is no outside anymore that can sustain life. The last safe rooms are not lifeboats. They are countdown timers. Somewhere above, in what used to be low Earth orbit, a space station, once a marvel of international cooperation, floats in a new kind of silence. Its crew, trained for microgravity, is the most prepared for this moment. They know how to move, how to secure themselves, how to manage air and water in a closed system. For them, the loss of gravity is not immediately catastrophic.
But even here, something is wrong. The station's orbit, once a precise balance between forward motion and gravitational pull, no longer exists. Without gravity, there is no curve to follow around the Earth. The station moves in a straight line, drifting away from the cloud of debris that used to be a planet. Through the windows, the view changes from a familiar blue and white sphere to a spreading field of fragments. Oceans turned to drifting spheres, continents reduced to broken plates, clouds dissolved into nothing. The crew watches in silence, knowing that every second carries them farther from any chance of returning to a home that no longer exists. They are not orbiting Earth anymore. They are leaving it. Back on what remains of the surface, the human body continues to struggle. Without gravity, the way the lungs expand and contract changes.
The diaphragm, no longer working against the weight of the chest, moves differently. Air does not circulate in the same patterns inside the lungs. Oxygen exchange becomes less efficient just as the oxygen outside is disappearing. People feel dizzy, then weak, then calm in a way that is almost deceptive. The brain, starved of oxygen, begins to dim the edges of consciousness. Panic softens into confusion. Confusion softens into quiet. In the last moments of awareness, many people do not scream. They drift. They reach for hands, for faces, for anything familiar. They look up at the sky, now filled with stars, and see a beauty that has never been visible in daylight before. It is the universe revealed at the very moment their world is ending. Elsewhere, in the few places where pressure still holds a little longer, people try to create order out of chaos. They organize themselves into roles, someone to monitor air, someone to manage water, someone to keep track of time. It is a reflex older than civilization to build structure in the face of the unknown. They share stories, not as a distraction, but as a way to remain human for as long as possible. They speak of ordinary days, of traffic, of school, of the smell of rain on warm ground, things that now feel like memories from another lifetime. Because they are. Outside, the debris field continues to expand. Pieces of buildings drift past each other, sometimes colliding gently, sometimes shattering into smaller fragments. The remains of vehicles, machines, and objects of every kind form a slow, silent storm around what used to be the surface. And within that storm, the last traces of human movement begin to fade. Not all at once, but gradually. A hand that no longer reaches, a voice that no longer calls out, a screen that goes dark. Humanity does not end in a single moment. It ends in millions of quiet ones, scattered across a planet that is no longer a planet. And in the vastness that surrounds it, there is no witness, no audience, no record that will be read by another species or another civilization. Only the laws of physics, continuing on as they always have, indifferent, precise, unchanging. The species that once wrote history, built monuments, explored oceans and skies, becomes part of the same drifting matter as everything else. Atoms returning to the same cosmic journey they have always been on. And yet, for a brief span of time in the universe, those atoms formed something extraordinary. They formed minds that could ask questions, that could imagine, that could look up at the night sky and wonder what held it all together. And now, in the absence of that invisible force, the answer is revealed in the most profound way possible. Everything that held us here, everything that allowed us to stand, to breathe, to live, was never guaranteed. It was a gift of the universe's structure, a quiet, constant force we never saw, never heard, but depended on in every moment. And as the last of humanity drifts into silence, that truth lingers, unspoken but undeniable. We were always being held, and without that hold, we are set free into a vastness that does not know our names. The drift continues, into darkness, into cold, into the endless open space where Earth used to be.
For thousands of years, civilization had been a story of weight, of stones stacked upon stones, of foundations pressed into earth, of roads carved into land that stayed exactly where it was. Every empire, every city, every monument was built on the quiet assumption that the ground beneath it would always remain. Now, that assumption is gone. Across the drifting remains of Earth, the final structures of human civilization begin to come apart in ways no engineer ever imagined. In the ruins of a once crowded financial district, glass towers that defined skylines for generations peel open like flowers. Their outer walls detach in shimmering panels that catch the sunlight before rotating slowly into darkness. Inside, office floors, once filled with desks, screens, and human ambition, separate into layers, drifting away from one another like pages of a book whose binding has failed. Paperwork fills the air, thousands of documents scattering into the void, contracts, letters, plans, each one a fragment of a system that no longer exists. Currency notes and coins spin through space, stripped of all meaning. Wealth, once measured and pursued, becomes indistinguishable from debris. In residential neighborhoods, the idea of home dissolves in real time. Houses that once held generations of memory break apart beam by beam. Walls separate from roofs. Doors float away from their hinges. Photographs drift out of frames, their images, birthdays, weddings, quiet afternoons, now untethered from the walls that once preserved them. A child's drawing, taped to a refrigerator the day before, now floats past the broken remains of a kitchen, turning slowly in the silent air. In places of worship where people once gathered to seek meaning beyond themselves, sacred spaces open to the stars. Domes split, spires detach and glide upward. Altars, statues, and candles drift together in quiet clusters, their symbolism intact even as their structures fail. The sound of bells, once rung by hand, fades into nothing as the air grows too thin to carry it. Libraries, repositories of knowledge spanning centuries, release their contents into space. Books open and scatter their pages, the words within them dispersing into a darkness where no eyes remain to read them. The collected memory of humanity, written in ink and paper, becomes a cloud of drifting stories. And beneath it all, the systems that powered civilization begin to fail in sequence. Power grids, once spanning continents, go dark as transmission lines pull free from towers and drift apart. Power plants, already compromised by the loss of cooling and structural integrity, shut down or break apart entirely. The glow of cities, those bright constellations visible from orbit, vanishes one region at a time. Night returns to Earth. Not the gentle night of stars and moonlight, but a deep, absolute darkness, broken only by the distant glare of the sun and the cold shimmer of debris. Transportation networks, the arteries of global civilization, dissolve into chaos. Trains separate from their tracks and drift like long, segmented creatures. Ships, already caught in rising oceans that are now leaving the surface, become part of floating spheres of water, their decks tilted at impossible angles. Roads fracture into segments that float away from one another, erasing the idea of distance and direction. There is no longer any way to go from one place to another, because there are no longer places. Borders, once fiercely defended, become meaningless lines that exist only in memory. Nations, defined by land, language, and shared history, lose the land that defined them. Flags drift away from poles, their fabric no longer pulled downward, hanging in strange, weightless folds before floating off into the dark. The political structures that governed billions of lives simply stop. Not with a final decree, not with a last broadcast, but with the quiet failure of the systems that allowed them to exist. Somewhere in a control room that once coordinated emergency response for an entire region, screens go black one by one. The last operator watches as data feeds vanish, communications fail, and the map of their jurisdiction dissolves into static. There is no one left to call. No one left to send. Only the knowledge that the system they served has reached its end. Even the symbols of human achievement in space begin to drift into obsolescence. Satellites, once locked in precise orbits by the balance of motion and gravity, now travel in straight, unbound paths. They pass by one another without purpose, their instruments still active for a time, recording data that no longer has a destination.
Navigation systems fail, weather monitoring ceases, global communication collapses into silence. Humanity had extended its reach beyond the planet, but that reach depended on the same force that has now vanished, and so it too comes apart.
In military installations across the world, weapons designed for defense and deterrence become inert. Missiles cannot be guided without stable trajectories. Aircraft cannot fly. Ships cannot sail. The idea of conflict, of one group of humans fighting another, loses all meaning in the face of a disaster that affects every human equally. For the first time in history, there are no sides, only a shared, unpreventable end. And yet, in the midst of this collapse, small acts of humanity persist for as long as they can. People help one another secure themselves to stable structures. They share the last of their water and air. They comfort strangers. They hold hands. In a drifting classroom, a teacher gathers a few students close, anchoring them with cords and fabric, speaking calmly even as the walls around them begin to separate. The lesson is no longer about mathematics or language. It is about staying calm, about staying together, about being human until the very last moment. In a hospital ward, a nurse hums a lullaby to a patient who can no longer respond, the melody faint in the thinning air, but still present. In a home that has broken into fragments, two elderly partners float side by side, hands clasped, eyes closed, as if simply resting. Civilization as a system of structures and technologies is ending, but humanity as a set of choices, kindness, connection, care, continues in these final, quiet moments. Outside, the planet continues its transformation. The debris field that was once Earth stretches wider, the pieces moving farther apart. What was once a single continuous surface is now a dispersed collection of fragments, each following its own path. The idea of a world dissolves completely, and with it the stage on which all of human history was written. From the first tools shaped by early ancestors, to the rise of cities along rivers, to the exploration of the skies and beyond, every chapter of that story required one simple condition: a ground to stand on. Without that ground, the story cannot continue. The fall of civilization is not marked by a single event. It is a process, a slow unweaving of everything that held human life together. And as the last lights go out, as the last voices fade, as the last structures drift apart, one realization remains, suspended in the silence that follows. Everything we built depended on something we never built. Everything we created depended on something we never controlled. Gravity was the foundation of our world, and without it, the world does not just change, it ends. Yet even in that ending, the fragments of civilization, its art, its tools, its machines, its memories, do not disappear instantly. They continue to drift, to exist, to move through space. A broken satellite panel glints in the sunlight. A piece of sculpture turns slowly, still bearing the marks of the artist who shaped it. A fragment of a bridge, once crossed by thousands every day, now floats alone, a silent monument to connection. These pieces carry with them the imprint of a species that once thrived. They become, in a sense, artifacts, evidence that for a brief moment in cosmic time, there was a world here filled with life, with thought, with meaning. But there is no one left to interpret them, no one left to remember what they meant. The fall of civilization is complete, and the silence that follows is not just the absence of sound, it is the absence of everything that made sound meaningful. The drift continues, and the story moves beyond humanity into the vast, indifferent expanse that now surrounds the remnants of Earth. At first, the moon's departure is almost imperceptible. For billions of years, it had traced the same slow path across Earth's sky, rising, setting, waxing, waning, so familiar that entire cultures measured time by its phases. It governed tides, guided travelers, inspired myths and calendars, poetry and prayer. Now, without gravity to bind it, the moon does not fall or rise. It simply continues forward. The curve of its orbit straightens into a line, and that line carries it gently, steadily away from the cloud of matter that used to be Earth. From the perspective of what remains of the planet, the moon appears to drift out of place. Its position in the sky shifts in ways that feel wrong, almost unsettling, as if a clock's hands had begun to move without rhythm. Then, as the hours pass, it becomes clear. The moon is leaving. Its familiar face, those dark maria and pale highlands that generations once saw as shapes and stories, begins to shrink. The details soften, the edges blur, until the great companion that once filled the night becomes just another bright object among many. The last full moon that humanity would ever see has already passed, and no one is left to mark its phase. Without the moon's gravitational pull, one of the most ancient rhythms on Earth stops instantly. The tides cease. For eons, the rise and fall of the oceans had sculpted coastlines, nourished ecosystems, and regulated the subtle balance between land and sea. Entire species evolved to live by that rhythm, the steady breathing of the planet's waters. Now, with gravity gone and the moon receding, that rhythm ends in a single, silent moment. The oceans, what remains of them, no longer pulse. They no longer rise to meet the shore or retreat into the deep. The concept of high tide and low tide disappears, along with the countless cycles of life that depended on it. Time itself begins to feel different, because the moon did more than move the seas. It helped stabilize Earth's rotation. For millions of years, its steady pull kept the planet's axial tilt from wandering too far, preserving a relatively stable pattern of seasons. It acted as a cosmic anchor, ensuring that Earth did not tip wildly from one orientation to another. Now, that anchor is gone. What remains of Earth, its fragmented mass of rock and ice, begins to wobble unpredictably as it travels through space. The idea of a stable north or south loses meaning. The axis around which Earth once spun becomes just another direction among many. Day and night, already fading as concepts, begin to dissolve entirely. There is no longer a predictable cycle of light and dark. Only exposure to the sun when fragments of Earth's debris face it, and shadow when they turn away. And in that shifting, irregular pattern, the last vestiges of the planet's old order disappear. The moon continues its silent journey outward. It does not shatter, it does not dim. It simply becomes more distant, more solitary, moving through space along a path that no longer intersects with Earth's remains. For the first time since it formed from a colossal impact billions of years ago, the moon is truly alone. It carries with it the memory of its long companionship, etched in its craters, in the scars of meteor impacts, in the footprints left behind by human explorers who once stood upon its surface and looked back at a blue world that no longer exists. Those footprints remain, untouched, frozen in place on a surface where there is no wind, no water, no erosion to erase them. They become the final physical record of a species that reached beyond its home, only to lose that home entirely.
As the distance grows, the moon's gravitational influence on Earth, already gone, becomes irrelevant. The two bodies, once locked in a delicate dance, now move independently, each following its own path around the galaxy. The bond is broken. And with it, one of the most fundamental relationships in Earth's history comes to an end. From a cosmic perspective, it is a quiet separation. No explosion, no collision, just two objects drifting apart. But from the perspective of life on Earth, if any life could still perceive it, it is the loss of a constant presence that had shaped every night sky ever seen by human eyes. Generations once looked up at the moon and saw a mirror of themselves, changing, cycling, enduring. Now that mirror is gone. The sky, already stripped of atmosphere, already filled with unfamiliar stars, becomes even more alien. There is no longer a large, bright companion to mark the passage of time, no crescent to signal the beginning of a month, no full disk to light the darkness. Only the distant sun, the scattered remains of a shattered planet, and the endless field of stars beyond. And in that field, the moon becomes just another traveler. It will continue for millions, perhaps billions of years, orbiting the sun on its own path, occasionally encountering other celestial bodies, perhaps even being captured by another gravitational system in the far future. But it will never again orbit Earth. That chapter is closed. Back among the drifting fragments of the planet, the absence of the moon's influence has subtle, final consequences. The delicate balance of forces that once shaped Earth's interior, its molten rock tides, its slow tectonic motions, comes to a complete halt. The internal breathing of the planet, influenced in part by the moon's pull, fades into stillness. The last dynamic processes that made Earth a living, changing world give way to stasis. What remains is inert, cold, unchanging. And in that stillness, the last echoes of a once vibrant system fade into silence. The moon, now a distant light, continues its journey. It carries no message. It leaves no farewell. It simply moves on. And in doing so, it marks the end of an era that lasted longer than human memory could ever hold. An era in which a planet and its moon shared a bond so fundamental that it shaped oceans, climates, and the very rhythm of life. That bond is now a memory, one that exists only in the laws of physics and in the traces left behind on a drifting, broken world. As the distance grows, the space around Earth feels emptier than ever before. And yet, the journey is not over, because even without gravity to bind it, Earth itself is still moving, still traveling, still carrying the remnants of everything it once was into a future defined not by orbits and cycles, but by a single, unbroken line through the darkness. The next chapter of that journey is about to unfold, and it will take the remnants of Earth farther from the sun than they have ever been.
At the exact moment gravity vanished, Earth did not stop moving. For billions of years, our planet had been traveling around the sun at an immense speed, about 30 kilometers every second, held in a delicate curve by the sun's gravitational pull. Remove that pull, and the curve disappears. What remains is motion, a straight, unstoppable line. So even as the oceans lifted, the air escaped, and the planet began to fragment, all of it, every stone, every drop of water, every last trace of civilization, continued forward at that same tremendous speed. Earth did not fall away from the sun. It flew away. From the perspective of the sun, the familiar third planet no longer circles in an orbit.
Instead, a widening stream of debris begins to peel away from its path, like sparks thrown from a spinning wheel. The distance between Earth and the Sun grows with every second. At first, the change is subtle. The Sun still appears large in the sky, still bright, still blinding. But without atmosphere to scatter its light, it is no longer surrounded by blue. It burns against a black background, a white disk in a sea of stars. There is no dawn, no dusk, only exposure and shadow. Fragments of Earth that face the Sun heat rapidly, their surfaces absorbing raw, unfiltered radiation. Without air to carry heat around the planet, temperatures become extreme. One side of a drifting piece of rock can be scorching hot, while the other side, facing away, plunges toward freezing in the same moment. Thermal stress fractures the material further. Rocks crack, metals warp. Structures that survived the initial disassembly now split apart under the strain of sudden, violent temperature changes. Meanwhile, the Sun, once the center of every day, every season, every agricultural cycle, begins to shrink. It is a slow shrinking at first, almost unnoticeable to the eye, but over hours, then days, the change becomes undeniable. The Sun occupies less and less of the sky, its warmth weakening as distance increases. The light that once bathed Earth becomes harsher, colder, more distant. The concept of a year loses meaning entirely. There is no orbit to measure, no return, just a one-way journey outward. As Earth's remnants travel farther, the radiation from the Sun no longer provides enough energy to keep anything warm. The heat absorbed by rocks and water during the final moments near the Sun radiates away into space, never to be replaced. Temperatures fall, first below freezing, then far below. Any remaining liquid water, those last drifting spheres that had escaped the surface, begin to crystallize. Ice forms from the outside in, creating hollow shells that eventually crack and disperse into glittering fragments of frozen shards. Even the thin traces of atmosphere that lingered in pockets between debris freeze into microscopic crystals, forming faint, shimmering clouds that drift for a time before dispersing. The last breaths of Earth become frost. And still, the planet's motion continues. The Sun, now smaller, becomes just one bright star among many. The familiar patterns of constellations remain for a while, but even they begin to distort as Earth's path carries it into new regions of space, altering the angles from which those distant stars are seen. The sky, once a fixed map used by sailors and astronomers, becomes unfamiliar, uncharted.
The remnants of Earth are no longer in a known place in the cosmos. They are travelers, rogue matter moving through interplanetary space and eventually into the vast stretches between stars. On what remains of Earth's larger fragments, those pieces that still resemble parts of a planet, the surface undergoes a final transformation. Without gravity, there is no longer a force to keep loose material settled. Dust lifts and drifts away, small rocks detach and float off into the void. Over time, the surfaces of these fragments become smoother, stripped of anything that is not chemically bound. The idea of landscape disappears. There are no hills, no valleys, no plains, only irregular shapes of rock and ice, slowly rotating, slowly cooling. The planet's core, once a churning sphere of molten metal generating a magnetic field that protected life from cosmic radiation, also begins to cool and fragment. Without the pressure of overlying mass and the pull of gravity to keep it together, the internal structure that defined Earth's geology breaks apart. The magnetic field fades. Cosmic radiation, high-energy particles from distant stars and galaxies, streams freely through the debris field, unimpeded. Any remaining molecules that might have hinted at life are slowly broken apart at the atomic level. The last chemical signatures of biology are erased. Time on this new trajectory becomes something different. There are no days to count, no cycles to measure, only distance from the sun increasing, second by second, kilometer by kilometer. If any observer could watch from afar, they would see a faint, expanding trail of matter leaving the orbit where Earth once was, a ghostly path marking the former presence of a planet. That orbit itself remains empty now, a silent track around the sun where nothing travels anymore. The third position from the sun is vacant. The solar system has lost a world, and the rest of the planets continue on, their own orbits unchanged, unaware in any meaningful sense of what has happened. Mars continues its red journey, Jupiter spins, its storms raging as always. Saturn's rings remain intact. The solar system as a system survives, but Earth is no longer part of it. The fragments that once formed continents, oceans, and civilizations now move beyond the gravitational influence that once defined their place in the cosmic order. They enter the realm of interstellar space, where distances are measured not in millions, but in trillions of kilometers. Here, the sun is no longer the dominant force. Here, darkness deepens. Temperatures approach absolute zero, the lowest possible limit of heat. The debris that was once Earth becomes part of the cold background of the galaxy. Occasionally, over immense spans of time, some fragments may encounter other objects, dust clouds, stray comets, perhaps even the distant outskirts of another star system. Some may be captured by new gravitational fields, becoming moons or minor bodies around foreign stars. Most will simply continue on, drifting forever. The story of Earth, once a story of cycles, day and night, seasons, years, becomes a story of a single, endless line. No return, no repetition, just a journey outward into the vast, quiet dark. And in that darkness, the memory of what Earth once was, blue oceans, green forests, cities filled with light and sound, exists only as a pattern of atoms moving through space. Atoms that once formed oceans, now part of frozen crystals drifting apart. Atoms that once formed living beings, now scattered, their bonds broken, their arrangements lost. The transformation is complete. Earth is no longer a planet. It is a cloud, a trail, a memory carried by matter. And yet, even as it leaves the sun behind, even as it enters the cold between stars, one final question lingers in the silence of that journey. What does it mean for a world to exist if the force that held it together can simply stop? The answer lies not in what remains of Earth, but in the realization of how fragile, how finely balanced that existence always was. And as the remnants of our world continue their silent voyage into interstellar space, that realization becomes the final legacy of a planet that once teemed with life. The journey is not over, but the world that began it is gone. Beyond the last fading warmth of the sun, beyond the outermost whisper of its light, the remnants of Earth enter a region where the universe feels immeasurably older, quieter, and far more vast than anything humanity ever imagined. This is not night as we once knew it. This is the absence of day itself. The fragments that were once continents, oceans, and cities now drift through a darkness so complete that even the nearest stars seem distant and faint. Without atmosphere, without reflection, without the familiar glow of the moon, the sky is no longer a ceiling overhead. It is an endless depth in every direction. There is no horizon. There is no up or down, only directionless space. The temperature continues to fall, inching closer to the lowest possible energy state allowed by physics. Any residual heat that remained from the sun is long gone, radiated away into the infinite cold. Rocks that once baked in sunlight now reach temperatures where atoms barely vibrate. Molecules slow. Chemical reactions cease. The very idea of change becomes rare. And in that stillness, the debris of Earth takes on a new identity, not as the ruins of a planet, but as a collection of ancient frozen objects moving through the galaxy. On one fragment, a piece of what was once a city facade still bears the faint outline of a window frame. It no longer looks like architecture, it looks like geology, a strange angular formation of stone and metal fused together by the stresses of its final moments near the sun. On another fragment, a thin sheet of what used to be ocean ice glints faintly in starlight, its surface etched with patterns that were once waves, currents, tides. Now they are static, frozen records of motion that will never resume. These fragments drift, rotate, and occasionally collide in slow, gentle contacts that produce no sound, no spark, just a slight change in direction, a subtle shift in trajectory. The debris field spreads thinner with time. Distances between fragments grow. What was once a dense cloud of matter becomes a sparse scattering of isolated objects, each moving on its own path through the galaxy. Time stretches. Without cycles of day and night, without seasons, without any repeating pattern, time is no longer experienced as a rhythm. It becomes a measure of distance traveled, of how far from the sun, of how far from the place where Earth once existed. If any observer could follow one fragment over millions of years, they would see the stars slowly change position relative to it. Constellations would distort, then dissolve, replaced by new patterns as the fragment moves through different regions of the Milky Way. The sky becomes a shifting map, but there is no one left to read it. The laws of physics continue their quiet work. Cosmic radiation passes through the fragments, slowly altering their atomic structures. High-energy particles strike molecules and break them apart. Over immense spans of time, even the most complex chemical remnants of life are reduced to simpler forms. What once carried DNA, memory, identity, becomes indistinguishable from any other arrangement of atoms in space. And yet, in a deeper sense, nothing is truly lost. The atoms that formed the oceans, the mountains, the bodies and minds of living beings, they remain. They continue their journey. They may, in billions of years, become part of something new, a new star, a new planet, a new form of life somewhere else in the galaxy. The story of Earth does not end in destruction. It transforms into diffusion, into possibility scattered across space. As the fragments travel farther from the sun, they eventually leave the region dominated by its gravity entirely. They enter interstellar space, not just beyond the planets, but beyond the influence of the solar system itself. Here, the nearest stars are light-years away. Distances are so vast that even at the tremendous speed Earth's remnants carried, it would take tens of thousands of years to approach another stellar system. Most never will. They will drift in the vast emptiness between stars for longer than human history ever lasted. Longer than the age of civilizations, longer, perhaps, than the time life existed on Earth in the first place. The long dark is not a moment, it is an era, a condition that stretches across millions and billions of years. During this time, the Milky Way itself continues to evolve. Stars are born in distant nebulae, others age, expand, and die. Supernovae flare and fade. Black holes merge in silent cataclysms that ripple space-time. All of it happens around and beyond the drifting remains of Earth, which continue on their quiet, linear path through the galaxy, unaware, unchanged. If awareness were still possible, if some fragment of consciousness could witness this journey, it would experience a universe that is both beautiful and indifferent. There would be moments when a fragment passes near a glowing nebula, a vast cloud of gas lit by newborn stars, colors spread across light-years of space. Moments when a distant supernova briefly outshines entire galaxies, its light reaching the drifting debris of Earth as a faint, temporary brightening in the sky. Moments when gravitational tides from passing stars gently alter trajectories, nudging fragments into new paths. But these moments would be rare. Most of the journey would be silence, cold, darkness. The long dark is the final environment of Earth's remains, a place where motion continues but change slows, where existence persists but life does not. And yet, even here, the story retains a quiet significance, because within this vast, empty expanse drifts the memory of a world that once was full of oceans, forests, voices, thoughts. A world that once wondered about the universe it inhabited. A world that asked questions about gravity, about the forces that shaped it, about what would happen if those forces ever changed. In the long dark, those questions are answered, not in words, not in equations, but in the silent trajectory of matter through space. Gravity was not just a force that kept feet on the ground. It was the thread that held together an entire story. Remove that thread, and the story does not simply end, it unravels. And the pieces of that story are carried outward, page by page, line by line, into a universe that continues without pause. The long dark is not the end of motion, it is the end of belonging. Earth's remnants no longer belong to a system, to a star, to a stable place. They belong only to the vastness. And in that vastness, one final chapter remains, one that does not belong to Earth or to humanity, but to the universe itself and the forces that govern it. Because even in a universe where gravity could, for one impossible moment, simply turn off, the deeper laws that shape reality still endure, and they have the final word. At first, humanity thought the darkness was punishment. Religions declared it a reckoning. Scientists called it an anomaly. Leaders called it a crisis. But as the years passed in the endless night, a quieter truth began to emerge. It wasn't punishment. It was a lesson. Without the sun, without the moon, without the invisible chains of gravity that once held everything in place, humanity was finally forced to confront something it had avoided for thousands of years. It was never in control. A different kind of survival. In the underground cities and the orbiting habitats, human life didn't just survive, it changed. People who once fought over borders now depended on one another for oxygen, heat, and food. Nations dissolved into networks. Currencies became meaningless. The only wealth that mattered was energy, knowledge, and cooperation. Children born in the drifting era had never seen a sunrise. To them, stories of blue skies and oceans under golden light sounded like myths. Yet those children grew up kinder. They grew up knowing that survival required unity, not division. The final discovery. Years into the darkness, a small team of scientists working in a deep space observation station made a discovery that would change everything. They found a pattern. The trajectory of Earth's drift wasn't random. It was guided, subtle, precise, almost intentional. Tiny gravitational fluctuations, barely measurable, were nudging Earth through space, like a leaf being carried by invisible currents. At first, they thought it was natural, but the calculations told a different story. The pattern was too perfect. A message without words. As Earth drifted farther, the darkness began to change. A faint glow appeared in the distance, another star system, closer with each passing year. The path Earth was following would carry it into a stable orbit around that star, a new sun, a new chance. And suddenly, humanity understood. No voice spoke, no signal transmitted, no alien ship appeared in the sky. Yet the message was unmistakable. You were never abandoned.
You were being moved.
The purpose of the silence. The scientists pieced together the timeline. First, gravity loosened. Then, the moon drifted away. Then, Earth followed. Each step forced humanity to adapt, to cooperate, to let go of its illusions of control and dominance. It had been painful, catastrophic, but it had also been transformative. War had ended, not by treaties, but by necessity. Greed had faded, not by law, but by irrelevance. Humanity had become something new, not by choice, but by survival. The real lesson. The greatest revelation wasn't that some unknown intelligence might have guided Earth. It was why. Humanity had reached a point where it could destroy itself, through war, through environmental collapse, through its own division. Left alone, it might not have survived its own power. So the universe, or something within it, had intervened, not to save humanity from disaster, but to force humanity to grow beyond it. A new dawn. Decades after the long dark began, the first light returned. At first, it was only a faint glow along the edge of the horizon. Then, slowly, steadily, the new star rose into view. For the first time in generations, sunlight touched the surface of Earth again. People came out of shelters and cities and stood beneath that unfamiliar sky. Some cried, some laughed, some simply stood in silence, feeling warmth on their skin for the first time in their lives. It wasn't the same sun, it wasn't the same sky, it wasn't the same world, and humanity wasn't the same species anymore. What they became. They had learned that control is an illusion, that survival requires unity, that intelligence without compassion leads to destruction, and that sometimes the universe doesn't punish, it teaches. And as the new dawn spread across the drifting Earth, humanity finally understood its place in the cosmos. Not rulers, not victims, but students, learning slowly and painfully how to become worthy of the universe they lived in.